Hello, and welcome to our next Life Sciences revision lesson for grade 11, where we are consolidating our knowledge on gaseous exchange and the respiratory system. In the last lesson, we managed to finish looking off at all the parts of the respiratory system and what exactly happens in them. So in this one, we are going to be looking at what can you expect in the examination. What types of questions can be asked on this particular section? So let's have a look at the different types of questions. First of all, you're always going to get some knowledge questions. Did you learn your work? Do you know what these different parts are called? So you need to know the parts and you need to know what do they do. In other words, what are their functions? You need to be able to label diagrams. In other words, you need to be able to recognize what each one of the parts that you have studied, what it actually looks like. And you do need to know your terminology. For example, you need to know what is the difference between gaseous exchange, respiration, and breathing. Because very often there will be questions which test to see if you actually do know the difference. Then there are questions which test your understanding. In other words, do you actually understand how the respiratory system functions? And one of these things is you need to know the adaptation. In other words, how are your lungs specialized to be able to absorb gas quickly and effectively? Then you also need to know how all of the parts actually work together. For example, you need to know that your nose and your trachea and your bronchi, they all work together to remove dust particles from the air you breathe in. The alveolus and the blood work together to get oxygen into the blood. So you need to know how all of these parts are actually interlinked. Then there will always be some application questions. And an application question is usually something you haven't seen before, something you haven't done in class, but it's related to what you've done in class. So if you see something you don't recognize, don't panic, look at it, and you will be able to work it out if you understand your work and you know what actually happens in each part. So these application ones are the ones that don't look familiar, but you will be able to work them out. You just have to look at them and think, well, what is this question actually asking me to do? Then there will also be some questions testing your practical skills. You might be given a table that you have to interpret. You might be given a graph that you have to interpret. You might be given a table and you might have to draw graphs. Or you might be given the description of an experiment and then you have to work out, well, what actually is happening in this experiment and then say what you think will happen. And then very often you have to then relate it back to what you know about how the respiratory system functions. Then there are always some experiments that are given to you that test your ability to apply your practical skills. For example, identify variables. What would the hypothesis be? What would the conclusion be? Then, the third specific aim is life science and how it applies to our everyday life. And here you need to know diseases. Oh, and you won't necessarily need to know the symptoms of the diseases, but you could be given a description of a disease and you would then have to be able to link it back to what you've done in class. So you must have an idea of what can go wrong in the respiratory system. Then, what effect does the way we live our life have on our lungs? For example, if we live in a polluted area, or if you are one of the people that smoke, what is this actually doing to your lungs? And here, very often you are given figures, statistics, and you have to work out how this is actually linked back to what you have done in class. Then, another very interesting aspect is that when you do exercise, you end up panting. In other words, exercise increases your breathing rate. Why? What is actually happening? And very often here, it is linked to your knowledge and understanding of the blood and heartbeat and things like that. So a lot of these application questions and questions on life sciences in society link a whole lot of different sections together. Let's have a look at some probable questions, and we're going to start off with the easy or the straightforward ones. So very often you are given, as here, you are given a diagram of the human respiratory system with the parts labeled. Okay, and then you would have to answer some questions. One of the questions is, have you learned your work? Do you know the names of all of these parts? Now, in a test or exam, you usually won't have to label all of the parts. You might be asked to label 2 or 3 of the parts. For example, what is A, what is B, what is C? So you have to be able to correctly identify the parts. Then the next thing, you could have to name the process that occurs. For example, here, what process is occurring in E? And that is obviously gaseous exchange. What process would C be involved with? And that is obviously the breathing process, inhalation or exhalation. So you would need to be able to explain where the different processes occur. Then you could also be asked, what is the function? And here you could be asked, what is the function of F, the trachea, making sound? What is the function of these things here, which are your cartilage rings? And you could be asked, well, why are there cartilage rings? What is their function? You could also be asked about what is inside A, which is the layer of mucus and cilia, which traps the dirt, and the cilia move the dirt upwards, so you can cough it up. So you have to be able to explain functions of any of these parts. Okay, then often right near the end is adaptations. Okay, and this is the adaptations of part A and E that improve its efficiency at carrying out its function. Okay, and for A, it would obviously be the cartilage rings that hold it open, and the cilia and the mucus, which trap the dirt. E, which is the alveoli here, and here you would talk about how the alveoli are adapted. For example, a thin lining, single layer of flattened cells, surface kept moist, large surface area, blood vessels underneath to carry the oxygen away, things like that. Now, one question would not ask you to do all of these, but I'm just giving you a selection of the types of questions that can be asked with a simple picture of the respiratory system. The second type of question is looking at the microscopic view of what's in the lungs, which is an alveolus. And again, you have to give the correct labels. What is A? A is squamous epithelium. What is B? B is the layer of moisture. What is C? C is a red blood cell. Then name the processes occurring. So here you would have to say, okay, what is happening here is called gaseous exchange. You can also sometimes be asked by what physical process does this gaseous exchange occur, and then you would have to say by the process of diffusion, moving from a high to a low concentration. You could also be asked to explain the process, and that would be probably for 3 or 4 marks. So you would have to talk about the carbon dioxide going from a high to a low concentration and the oxygen going from a high to a low concentration. Okay, adaptations. That's the same question as in the previous one. What about the alveolus makes it very efficient at carrying out its function? Thin wall lined by liquid blood vessels under the skin, all of those ones that we've mentioned several times before. Then, this is different. What type of blood is found in parts 1 and 3? And part 1 is the blood that's been round the body and it's going to the lungs, so that is obviously deoxygenated blood. And part 3, it's been past the alveoli, it's picked up the oxygen, so that is obviously oxygenated blood. Third one, and here it's a picture of a little experiment or a model, and this is a model of ventilation. Remember, ventilation is breathing in and out, the movement of your body, and this is a model which shows the type of thing that happens in your body. Okay, so you would first have to say what parts of the human body are represented by each part of the model. Okay, and the balloons obviously represent your lungs. A obviously points to the trachea. B points to the bronchiole. The bell jar would be your rib cage, and the rubber sheet which moves up and down would be the diaphragm. Then identify the stages represented by diagram 1 and 2. 1 would be before you breathe in, or exhalation, because if you have a look, not much air in the lungs, whereas what's happening here, this would be inhalation because air is moving into the lungs. Then you also can be asked, how is the bell jar not accurate in being what happens, or in showing what happens in your rib cage? And that, of course, is the bell jar cannot move, whereas in your body, the rib cage does move. And then you would be sent to some questions where you actually have to illustrate that you know exactly what happens. So you would have to say in diagram 2 exactly what is happening inside the rib cage and the diaphragm, and you talk about diaphragm lowered, pressure inside the thoracic cavity being lower, air rushing in, things like that. Hope this has helped. Take a break. Welcome back. I hope by now you've got lots of oxygen in your brain, because we're now going to look at some questions that are a little bit more tricky. In other words, these are the application questions looking at something you haven't really seen before. It's also looking at a little bit of your practical skills to see if you can interpret what's going on. So let's have a look. Okay, so this is somebody who has asthma, uses an inhaler, and the medication in the inhaler increases the diameter of the bronchioles. Then you are given a table, and the table shows certain amount of time after exercise, how much he can, or how the volume of air he can breathe in if he doesn't use the inhaler, and if he does use the inhaler. So basically, before you even look at the questions, we say, okay, this is showing us that without the inhaler, he can breathe in a lot less air than he can if he uses the inhaler. Now, is that logical? Yes, it is, because what does the medication do and the inhaler do? It increases the diameter of the bronchioles. Once you understand what the table is telling you, now let's start having a look at the questions. Right, starting off, simple questions. Describe how his breathing rate changed after he started exercising, and that is normal here. And with exercise, what happens in both cases? His breathing rate increases. Reason, when he's doing exercises, oxygen must get to the cells and carbon dioxide must be taken away from the cells. Then, theory, which two muscles would act, and that would be the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. Then, practical skills, draw a line graph, and this line graph would have two lines, one for with the inhaler and one for without the inhaler. Next, linking back to your theory, how would increasing the diameter of the bronchioles help him to breathe? And you would then talk about if the bronchioles are wide open, more gas can pass through them with one breath, therefore he'll be able to get in more oxygen. Then, discuss the effect the inhaler has on his breathing 10 minutes after exercise. So you find where it says 10 minutes after exercise, that's this row there, and it says discuss the effect the inhaler has on his breathing, and what you basically have to do, you have to compare. Without the inhaler, he can breathe in 3.3 liters per second, whereas with the inhaler, he can breathe 4.8 liters per second. That's a third more with the inhaler. And that's obviously why he uses the inhaler, to enable him to play his sport. Sorry about that. Then there are some questions looking at your practical skills. Independent variable, and remember the independent variable is what are you changing, and that is he using the inhaler or isn't he? The dependent variable, that's what you are measuring, and you are measuring the volume of air he can take in a certain number of minutes after the exercise. Then the next one makes you think a little bit. Obviously, when he does this, he's doing the exercise 2 times. Once without the inhaler and the second time with the inhaler. And the next question is, what needs to be kept the same? And that is, he's got to do the same type of exercise at the same intensity for the same length of time, so that we know if there are any differences, it's only the inhaler or lack thereof that's making the difference. I told you these were difficult. This one is an application question, and it's something you've never seen before, but you can work it out. You have to think. You look at the diagram and you say, right, what is the diagram telling me? There are some processes that occur in humans. So let's look at what we've got here. Oh, there are funny little things like that, but hey, they look like lungs. And here are little round things, which are the cells. And what would these be? That would obviously be the red blood cells. So once you've worked out what it's telling you, you can start looking at the questions. So identify the process occurring at A and B in the diagram, and the process occurring here would be gaseous exchange in the lungs, and at B it would be gaseous exchange in the tissues. But it's still gaseous exchange. Then describe 2 adaptations of part A that make it efficient at carrying out its function. Part A, lungs. And those are the same things we've come across before: large surface area, single layer of cells to enable gaseous exchange to occur quickly. So that's linking to your theory. Okay, then now you have to think it out. Gases are transported between A and B by blood. At which point will the blood have more oxygen? Okay, so you look at the arrows, and the arrows show gas going into the blood and the blood going along to the cells. Here, the blood is coming from the cells. So which one would have more oxygen? It would obviously be number 1, and the reason is it's coming from the lungs. So obviously it's full of oxygen. 2 is coming from the cells, so obviously it would be full of carbon dioxide. Then discuss the form in which the oxygen and carbon dioxide would be transported between A and B. And here you would have to talk about, in the red blood cells, you would have to talk about the hemoglobin, which the oxygen enters the red blood cells, links to the hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. The oxyhemoglobin then, as it goes past the cells, the oxygen leaves the oxyhemoglobin and goes into the cells. So that's oxygen. Okay, so next let's have a look at how carbon dioxide, and here the carbon dioxide is transported in several ways. Some of it can be part of the hemoglobin, in which case it would go into the red blood cells and be carried attached to the hemoglobin. But it also dissolves in the plasma. Okay, and then in the plasma it forms bicarbonate ions or carbonic acid, and it would then be transported from the cells back to the lungs. Oh, sorry, I thought I had another question there for you. I sincerely hope that looking at these questions has helped you understand a little bit, and you won't get a fright when you actually see questions. We haven't done this in class. From what you've done in class, you should be able to work out the answers. I wish you successful studying.